Hey friend, have you wanted to learn how to weld? I think you should. I've picked up welding in the past couple of years, 3 years ago exactly, and it's my favorite skill set that I've developed time into learning, and I think it's a lot easier to get into than most people expect. At least that's been my experience. I was more intimidated about how difficult it might be and was pleasantly surprised how quickly I ended up making projects that I liked. We're gonna tackle a lot in this. This video is sponsored by SquareSpace, my go-to tool for building websites. So the main takeaway and punchline of this video is, if you wanna learn how to weld, I think you should just go buy a cheap welder and start trying to weld. I think that's the fastest way to learn. So if there's anything that you take away from this video and you're the kind of person that's been like, I wanna get into welding, maybe should I think you should just go buy a cheap welder and start. And I always assumed that welding was really hard, and in order to get something functional, you needed years and decades of experience. Yes, pipeline, structural welds, those kinds of things, that craft is on a whole other level. Guys doing TIG welding, stainless, titanium, all those specialty kind of welds, yes, those are an absolute art form of a science that I respect so much what those guys are doing in their knowledge. But let me just be really blunt with you. Steel assembly with a Canadian Tire welder is easy. You get a bottle of gas, you get the right wire, you learn what the stuff means, you learn your settings, and assembling things with a little welder like that is very straightforward. You clean your material, cut your joints well. Steel welding is very straightforward.
So this video turned out to be pretty massive, and I'd love for you to use it as a choose your own adventure, to just jump around the different sections and chapters for whatever interests you, from the philosophy of how I approach learning how to weld, from what I think is the best welder to start on, to the little tools that I find very helpful that I wish I knew existed earlier. This is technically part 3 of a series of videos that we're making about the shipping container I will continuing to be converting into an off-the-grid capable shop. If you're watching and you go, oh, that's not the right word or explanation, or there's a better way to be doing that, I can assure you this video is already way too simple for you, and you're further along than even I am, so don't worry about it. This video is not for you. And if you have any tips, please leave them in the comments, because those are always helpful. But again, I'm doing this from a beginner's perspective. I am not an expert. The structure of this video is going to look like this. I'm going to talk through how to start, the exact tips that I would go through from not having a welder to laying your first bead. Then we'll cover a section on what type of welder I think is worth getting as a beginner that's going to grow with you for the different types of projects you may want to do. I'll cover my favorite tools for under 50 bucks that have been really helpful for metalworking in general that I didn't really know exist, but I find super helpful. I'll then cover 7 things that I wish I knew before starting welding. This is kind of like more philosophy about how to approach learning. Then we go into a massive Q&A section addressing most of the questions that I've gotten so far on the container videos. So rapid fire off the top here, how would I get into welding if I've never welded before? Buy whatever welder you can get your hands on. More tips on that in a sec. Read the operational section of the manual so you know how to feed wire, work the machine, and change settings. Decide on the first project you want to build, like a table or a shelf. Buy the material and cut a bunch of practice sections to do testing on. Reference the chart with your machine as a starting point for the weld settings of the material you want to weld. Try to start welding. In about 30 to 50 minutes from buying the machine, you should be able to get something that resembles a weld happening. See, look, this is my first weld. Then I would go to YouTube and watch welding videos that show you what the puddle of a weld looks like when you're welding different kinds of joints with a MIG welding setup. These videos are super helpful, often great explanations from really talented experts, but often filled with so much information that you only learn 1 or 2 things at a time. Take the 1 or 2 things you learn back to your project, try laying some more weld. If you run into an issue, stop, Google the answer, try find a solution, watch more videos, go back to your project, and eventually over time, if you rinse and repeat this back and forth, you will get closer and closer to a weld that's gonna be strong, and you should end up with the finished project. Then repeat this process over and over and over with new projects, scaling up the size, trying different things, stretching your skill set, always searching for the answers to the things that you run into so that way you can learn more. And through all of this, I must say, respect the fact that you can get hurt in a lot of different ways if you're careless. Things are very hot. You're dealing with molten metal. There's lots of off gases. If you're using grinders, there's many ways to injure yourself So respect it. Learn about the protective equipment that you would like to use, because there's just a lot of ways you can hurt yourself.
From a beginner's perspective, the type of welding that I think is most straightforward and helpful to learn and will take you the furthest, I think you should learn MIG welding if you want to do steel assembly of projects like what you've seen me do on this channel. Wire feeds from inside the machine through the gun and meets at where you're going to weld. So inside of here, there's a spool. It comes all the way down the hose and it comes out the end here. Let me see if I can explain this in a simple way, but when you hot glue, you're adding a glue to the outside of two materials and you're sticking them together. Welding is not that. Where the wire is coming out, that is creating basically a molten reaction in your joint, and you're actually fusing the two pieces of material together. So don't think of the filler wire as just the thing that is gluing. It's actually the goal of welding is to penetrate into the two materials and fuse them together. But the process of MIG welding, where the wire is coming through here, allows you to learn it quickly. The intro level to learning it is very quick and you can get results fast. And then the ability to do larger projects expands with it. So all of this is assuming that the main thing you're wanting to weld together is just basic steel. So that's called mild steel. And this is like just ordinary steel that you can get from a lot of different places. And it's one of the more common materials that people like me are trying to build together into things. So welding together steel with MIG is what I strongly recommend, because the ease of use, the experience of it is awesome. I really enjoy MIG welding. It's quite an easy learning curve. You can go get a MIG welder from basically any hardware store. From $300 to $1,000 Canadian, you can get yourself a great machine that you can then add peripherals to make it do other types of processes. So typically when you get a machine like this, it will come with spools of flux core wire. So this wire that I have here doesn't have any shielding built onto it. So what the shielding means is where you're doing your reaction of the weld at that site where you're fusing metals and making them molten, you need a gas protecting around that area so that way it doesn't get oxidization and porosity. And basically if there's no shielding happening over that delicate site, you're going to end up with a weld that is not strong, is easy to crack, doesn't fuse properly. That's not good. You don't want that. So flux core is very straightforward. You can use it in windy environments. It's great, and you don't need gas to do it. So you can get started right away. That's a fine process to learn. It's great because deep penetration for your weld is straightforward with flux core. Flux core is fine. You might find yourself wanting to jump over to not doing flux core. Maybe you want welds that look a little cleaner or don't have as much slag on it, or for whatever reason. Jumping over to a gas bottle setup is what allows you to run other types of wire that don't have the shielding, the flux core built onto it. I wish that I knew when I was getting into this that the wire I was going to be using most of the time is 035. I'm going to be welding mild steel. And if I get into a gas, basically I just need the argon CO2 mix for welding mild steel with MIG. And you hook that up to your system and you get a welder going that is pretty capable for doing a lot of different projects. And you can get started without the investment into gas bottles for a lot cheaper. But if you buy a welder that is able to do shielding gas, like it's got the hookup for it, it opens up a lot of flexibility. And yes, there is more expensive machines, these multi-process machines that can actually do TIG welding as well. And these other types of welding where you're adding filler rod or you want to do stick. And if you want to go the route where you eventually learn TIG welding, which is able to do a lot more specialty applications in metal types, it might be worth it actually to learn stick welding first, because that has a higher entry level of difficulty. But once you learn how to puddle control with stick, it makes TIG welding tons easier. But if all of that is just like not in your wheelhouse, don't worry about it. I recommend going the MIG route with flux core, getting a bottle of gas. Any cheap welder from any department store is going to do just fine. I don't know, read some reviews online, but basically anything that you end up buying, I think is going to be fine. Just be aware of its limitations if you're trying to go to thicker materials, because Jumping over to 240 volt, that's going to allow you to do thicker metals because you can run a higher heat weld because it's got more power available. It's not just going off a 15 amp 110 circuit. You can get just a 110 welder, and that's gonna be able to do a lot of projects, and maybe that's just fine for you. But be aware of the limitations on material thickness. So research on whatever model you're considering buying and just try to figure out what's the thickest I can weld with that machine and the wire size that I can put into it. And if that's not as thick as you want to go, jumping up to a 240 volt welder is great. And I specifically went to this model because it was spool gun capable. This is still what's considered a hobby level machine. So the quality of spool gun you can buy, you're limited to because of the types of connections that's on it. But the reason why you want a spool gun is for welding aluminum. Spool gun aluminum isn't my favorite way to do aluminum, but it's the lowest barrier to entry, especially when you're using shielding gas. And the reason why you need to use a spool gun when doing MIG aluminum and you don't have a push-pull machine is because aluminum filler wire is so soft. So running it down the whole hose to your point of weld, that's not going to go well if you're not using a spool gun. So like this, the spool is super close to where your weld is going, so it doesn't have much distance to travel. It's not pushing it or pulling it very far. And this is what gets you in the aluminum game. And you can buy different spool guns for different types of machines, but it just so happens that the cheaper Lincoln machines are capable with the 100 SG spool gun Magnum. It's fine. It leaves a lot to be desired. It's expensive. It was like $500 and it's a lot of plastic. But this is what got me into the aluminum game, so that way I could do my roof rack build and other things like that. And aluminum is quite enjoyable to work with, as far as the fact that you can use your standard woodworking tools to cut it, to manipulate it. It's nice and soft. It's light. I love aluminum. Welding it is difficult, but I got this specific machine because I could attach this spool gun and get into the aluminum game. And that's kind of what's required to do that. I want to quickly address some of the most useful items that I didn't know existed that have really helped me. The one that I want to start with is a digital caliper that shows you fractions. I don't think in fractions very well because I'm not a carpenter, I'm not a metal worker, and I haven't lived in that world my whole life. And so when someone says that a material is 5/16, my brain has a very challenging time immediately visualizing what that thickness is. And so when you walk into a store and you say, hey, I need 4 feet of this kind of steel, and they go, what thickness? And you're like, crap, I only thought dimensionally. That's a good time to ask them, well, hey, what thickness do you recommend? And then they'll ask you some more. That's a great time to ask a question. But also having this digital caliper, this is just a cheap one from Amazon. It can switch between millimeters, inches, and fractions. And this is so helpful for me, especially when I'm ordering parts and I see the measurements online and I'm like, what thickness is that? Next piece that I'm really happy with is this really small combination square. I use this all the time. It just lives in my pocket. Because it has the oversized edge, it can sit nicely up on a piece of material for marking it out. Measuring thicknesses and depths of things by setting it on something. This gets used all the time. I love this. Another really helpful measuring tool is just a metal speed square. This is really quick for doing lines, for cutting. It's metal, so if you're working with hot material, it doesn't melt and that kind of thing, and it can get knocked around a little bit and it's gonna be fine. But a digital torpedo level is really helpful. This is magnetic, so it attaches to the material. It'll show me a digital number, either right side up or upside down. Moving to drill bits. A spotting bit is amazing for metalwork. It's like a 45-degree angle and it's very sharp. It's not actually meant for making a hole. What it is meant for marking where you're going to start drilling with another kind of bit. And it's very easy to hold it in place on the material and it doesn't wander. So I use these all the time for where I'm like going to start my hole instead of using a punch. And this is just so invaluable. We use this all the time on the van project. Massive stepping bits. So it's got the wider diameter as you drill through your hole. I use this all the time. I really like the Milwaukee ones, especially with the hex shank. They're kind of expensive, but they're worth it. The Milwaukee ones have been my favorite, and they make making holes in metal so much easier, so you don't have to keep swapping your drill bit as you keep going bigger. Stepping bits, amazing. For marking lines, I use an X-Acto knife. So this is just a Milwaukee fastback kind of open version. I like this because it's easy to swap out the blades because you are dulling them out if you're using them right on steel. but I'll just hold it right up to my square, come down it, and it'll mark on steel or aluminum, no problem. These paint pens, sometimes they're frustrating, but they do work well on metal. So having paint pens around is fantastic for marking out where you're going to cut. I also find you can never have enough of these magnetic dishes for putting bits and things and doodads in, especially if you're disassembling something and you're not wanting to lose bolts. These are great. Watching videos in other people's shops, especially before I got into metalworking myself, I never knew why they had so many grinders around. I'm like, don't you just like swap the disc with the tool? Like what's the point of having that many grinders? And it's hard to describe the sheer quality of life you feel when you have several grinders for the different purposes. So as you're working through your project, you can just move from each grinder one to the other. The speed that it saves you, the joy that you feel. I'm of the opinion now that you can never have too many grinders because they are so massively helpful.
When you don't got a friggin' fart changing the wheels mid-project, it gives you an enormous sense of well-being. Grinder and paint makes me the welder I ain't.
I don't think I knew how much I would be using a handheld grinder. They're indispensable in metalwork. I didn't know, and this is because I was a beginner, I didn't know that people used any kind of sanding tools on metal. But flap discs was what I was introduced to by Brandon from Coastal Off-Road when I was finishing my bumper build to get that nice smooth finish. And a flap disc is just worth its weight in gold. This is the most used device on a grinder when I'm working on a welding project. I thought these big chunky abrasive discs that were just always on the grinder growing up, I thought this is what guys use for metalwork, and I could never figure out how they got like smooth finishes on their material and why mine always looked so bad. I rarely use these big thick guys except for massive like big welds that I'm trying to smooth down quickly, but then I stop before I get all the way down and I come by with a flap disc like this. When a flap disc is well used, it starts getting a nice rounded shape to it. And that's fantastic for notching tubing, for getting in there and making that nice smooth curve. It's really nice for beveling edges. So when you want to get a nice curved radius on a piece of steel, I really like flap discs. I buy these in 40 and 80 grit for different types of finishing, but I really like these all steel Walter ones, especially the kind that aren't thread on. I like it where the shank goes through and you actually clamp it down. When they're plastic and they're thread on, it is easy to break them off. This brand is my favorite. I buy these in counts of 10. These are 80 grit. Zip discs are my other most used disc on a grinder for cutting material. They're very thin, but they work amazingly well for just, it's like a hot knife through butter, cutting steel with them. I get the 4-inch and the 5-inch ones. These do explode. So all abrasive discs, all discs on a grinder can explode. So it's a good practice to off-center grind, like move your face away from where you're grinding. Having a guard on is wise a lot of the time. For finishing, using a 3M Scotch-Brite pad with a plastic holder on a grinder. This is an amazing way to just finish and prep things for painting, cleaning, removing mill scale. I had no idea Scotch-Brite pads were even a thing on grinders, but they are so massively helpful for metal cleaning and prep and kind of just finishing off the look of your project. So getting into Scotch-Brite is a massive improvement. I recommend starting with 2 grinders. One that's a heavier duty, higher amperage corded grinder for when you need to remove a lot of material from your welds, or you're working on a lot of steel stuff and you just need to do a lot of grinding. The higher amperage is going to just be better for heavier use applications because it's corded, it won't run out. And then I really, really like having a battery operated grinder for quick stuff. This DeWalt XR one is nice because it's got a brake built in. So when you use it, by the time you're going to set it down, it's already stopped spinning. So I really appreciate that. You don't have to buy DeWalt. Just any battery operated one is helpful. Just be mindful that the battery is going to run out so you can't use it for long jobs. I didn't actually intend to end up with this many grinders. I got these from an auction house for businesses that basically went bankrupt or closed or whatever. And you can find stuff on auction and get it really cheap. So I was after these large batteries because they just have higher capacity. And getting a set of these batteries, grinders came with it. So I started with one cordless and one corded, and now I have basically 4 grinders. And moving between The flap disc I use all the time for smoothing down the welds, getting 45-degree angles on it when I'm prepping a joint to be welded. This guy right here is a new disc to me, but it's primarily for removing paint without much of the metal material. So that's kind of nice, because even if you use a sanding flap disc and you're using that to remove paint, paint will get clogged up in the flap disc. And also, if you remove too much, then you start to take away your actual material. So I like these guys right here. It's actually very functional. I'm quite pleased. I bought a 4 set, and I'll definitely be buying more of these for just removing exterior paint. The first main thing that I wish that I had known before I got into welding was I'd spent a lot of time researching how to get around welding. Maybe you've done something similar, like how to weld aluminum on the cheap without a welder. If you've found yourself running into how to find shortcuts around welding, I personally wish that I had realized sooner I should probably tackle learning how to weld. And now that I have started, I'm finding all these different ways to use welding in projects to make them better. And it's just one of those things that if you're trying to find shortcuts around welding, you're probably the kind of person that should go out and buy a cheap welder and start welding, because it's easier than you might expect to get usable results quickly. Lesson number 2, just because I'm not going to be an expert at it overnight, or maybe even ever an expert, that doesn't mean there isn't lots of benefits from becoming a beginner. I think that's the beauty of metalwork. Being a beginner at it yields a lot of positive results. And metalworking is this thing where it's like a mixture of chemistry, physics, engineering, and just elbow grease to finish a project. And the problem is that there's so many things that you can learn. There's an unlimited ceiling of things to specialize in and to get more knowledgeable about in different processes. And that can be intimidating, because then you think it's not even worth starting. But I think of it kind of like, you know, if I haven't gone out and done a wilderness first aid course, or if I'm not going to med school to be a doctor, is it not worth then me learning how to properly care for a small wound? You know, it's one of those things, right, where learning how to self-care a small wound is a really beneficial skill set. You don't need a wilderness first aid course to do it. You don't need to be a doctor, and the amount of benefit that you can experience immediately from proper wound care on yourself is immense. So that's kind of my philosophy around metalworking. So that leads us nicely into thing number 3, and that is, if you're gonna get into welding, if you're gonna go to a department store and buy a quick little welder to start with, if you're gonna go down that road, embrace not knowing. And what I mean by this is, okay, so this is multifaceted. The local welding supply shop is going to be way more of a friend than you'd ever expect. So in most towns, if there's, you know, shops, if there's things getting built, which is most places in continental North America, unless you live out in the boonies, there's going to be a welding supply store, a place that you can fill up or exchange bottles of gas. And where you exchange bottles of gas, there's often welding supplies like nozzles, tips, wire, those kinds of things. I would recommend, if you're going to go out and buy a welder, before you even do that, go to some of these shops. In your area, there might be 3 to 5 of them. Show up there, walk up to the counter, don't go during the busiest hours, and express where you're at in your journey. Say, hey, I'm just getting into welding. This is what I want to do with it. What advice do you have for me as far as bottle ownership, the process of getting into welding? And you're going to learn really quickly which shops are open to that kind of customer and which ones aren't. And this isn't the fault of the shop. You know, a lot of them are geared towards helping industry, and they want to move quickly. They want people that know what they're doing coming into their store with accounts, moving in and out. That's the customer they serve. But some of these shops, even if they serve those customers, they're also very enthusiastic about those getting into it. So having conversations with them about, well, he's asking me, okay, well, what thickness of metal are you going to be welding? And then I'm kind of like, oh, I actually don't really even know. And so they were super gentle with me. And that's where I think it's critical to say, I don't know. That is a really fine answer to give. When you're talking to someone behind the counter, you might think that they want to hear from you that you know what you're doing. I know the metal thickness I want. I know the type of material I want. But the thing is, if you don't actually know the answer, if you don't know what kind of metal thickness you want, say that, because then oftentimes if they're the right kind of place, they'll be able to inform you about why. So I learned fairly quickly, I don't want to be welding 1/2-inch steel because my welder can't even do that. So learning those things and getting familiar with thickness types of material, having a place that will gently inform you, the I don't know answer to their questions at that kind of place is massively helpful. And those stores are worth their weight in gold. So develop a relationship with a local welding supply store if you want to get into welding, the kind of store that is receptive to a beginner, because that is worth so much. Lesson number 4 is a lesson that I'm still learning painfully. And it's just that so much of building things out of metal is the measuring, cutting, and designing. That is a vast majority of what's going to end up with a final result that is good. So when you're getting into it, it's a good first project to try and make like a cart for your welder, or a bottle holder, or a table to weld on. Those are good first projects. And the thing is that you're wanting to weld because you're learning how to weld. And so I recommend cutting tons of pieces of metal to lay beads on and actually practice the process of welding, because you need to spend a lot of time on your machine to get used to it and how it behaves and the sounds to listen to. More on settings and stuff later. I'll talk about that in a sec. But you expect, because you're learning how to weld, so much of what you're doing with metalworking will be welding, but that's such a small fraction of what makes a successful project. And let's say your weld quality is only 3 out of 10 or something. You can get a functional built thing with a 3 out of 10 quality weld. You don't need a perfect weld if you're not doing some structural specialty application. You can have porosity in your weld on your table and it's still gonna hold together, and that's okay. And that's where so much of what makes a nice finished product in the fabric cobbling world, where you're just kind of throwing things together on a whim and measuring it and just figuring it out as you go, comes down to the attention to detail with the cutting, with the measuring. So refining those skill sets and being patient. In the learning process, there's an urgency to go quickly, and there's a standard of how you want things built that seems way higher than you're capable of. And somewhere in the middle there, you've got to arrive at projects that you can tackle to get that forward momentum and to kind of taste that addictive feeling of accomplishment when you're done something. But I can't recommend enough spending more time thinking through design, measuring well, cutting well, all of those things. If you slow down in that process and really just embrace that that's a majority of metalworking, you're going to have a better experience overall. Okay, the 5th thing is one that I feel that I was proved right with the process of learning metalworking, and that is embrace your learning style and just press into it. So for me, I'm a mixture of asking tons of questions of someone that's in person with me. So I love that tactile experience of a real human that's right there that I ask questions of, hands-on experience, and then deep diving to resources that are available online. So that's kind of my mixture. I want to tack on 2 more quick lessons here that I thought of as I was talking before I move on to your great questions. One of them being the massive importance of great penetration with your weld without worrying about stacking dimes with your MIG. MIG is the process that I typically do, where wires coming out the gun. I talked about it at the beginning. It's easy to want to get welds that look like what you see people do typically with a TIG setup, like the stacking dimes look, where it's those nice little sections just stacked up like scales, and it looks so beautiful. When I was learning, I wanted to imitate that with my MIG setup. But what I didn't know, that by doing that, I'm spreading out the puddle in a way where I'm wrecking my fusion. So this is something that takes a while to start to get more familiar with, but I would strongly recommend getting familiar with the best push process shape to do with your weld that's going to get the best penetration for your specific joint, and just really focusing on getting good heat to the weld, good fusion, instead of good shape and prettiness, because prettiness with a cold weld is bad. It's not going to be strong. So one of the things I wish I'd started doing earlier when I'm doing my test welds on a project before I finish the assembly is, when I do the weld, take that and put it in a vise and hit it with a hammer a bunch of times. If the weld cracks off easily, that's bad. But if your material starts to bend and twist around the weld, and the weld is behaving as if it's an extension to the material itself, that is a good sign. That means your weld is heading towards a direction where it's actually adding a lot of strength. But if that weld cracks off, if it's basically not melting into the material base that you're welding, bad, bad, bad. So don't do stupid, funny patterns that are ruining your penetration like I was. Focus on a good pattern with your MIG gun, and it's going to get you a lot further. Unless you're just closing a gap and using it as caulking and it's not structural. Sometimes doing big dimes is the easiest to close the gap, but that's another thing. The other final tack on lesson here that really applies to some of the questions that I'm going to get later about how did I learn how to build things and what materials to get. Get familiar with an online store so that way you can see the different material types that are available. Like in the woodworking world where there's 2x6s, 2x12s, 2x4s, different sheets of plywood at different thicknesses, different plywood types, the same things exist with metals. And if you're like me and you're trying to picture how to build something in your head and you don't know what kind of metals are available to build that thing, it can be very intimidating. So before you even walk into a metal store, go to onlinemetals.com, go to McMaster-Carr, click on the different types of tubing. And what I love about McMaster-Carr is that for the different metal types, they'll tell you what those properties add and benefit. So, hey, this type of alloy is very easy to weld, works for high strength applications. It's got this PSI breaking strength, and it'll describe it to you. Getting familiar with materials that you like working with, using a website like McMaster-Carr is very helpful. That's where I sized out the gas struts to order for this sized application. That's where I found things like T-handle latches. I didn't even know those existed for me to use in projects. So if you can, actually get a McMaster catalog to look through and see what kind of parts can I use for building things, because what's on the shelf at Home Depot is not going to be everything that's available, and finding out different ways to build things is very exciting. Before we dive into rapid fire questions, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, and that is SquareSpace. I really love SquareSpace, and the reason for that is they make sharing my ideas with the world a lot easier. You need your own home base, a place where you're not at the mercy of some algorithm to show posts to your followers. You want to run your own email list. Well, where are you going to send people to sign up for your email list? Well, you need a website to do that. You want to run your own e-commerce store. You need a website to do that. You want to tell people that your film is coming. If you have an idea, make it real by having a home base for it online. If you've got a business you want to start, I'm just so passionate about getting small businesses and makers to actually represent themselves well online, and getting a website going is one of the better ways that you can do that in conjunction with your whole online experience. So SquareSpace has all the tools you need to get you started with an all-in-one website builder experience. You can find a domain through them. You can do your analytics through them. You can use their drag and drop system to build a beautiful website, and their customer support is incredible. So I recommend, if you want to try out SquareSpace, head over and start a trial to see what it looks like, see what it builds like. Pick a template, make a website, put your images on, and when you're ready to commit, make sure that you use my code for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. You had so many questions about this door build and metalworking in general, and I'm going to tackle them all together in this rapid fire section. What could one expect to spend for an entry-level equipment setup? Getting a welder going, $300 to $500. All the peripherals, gloves, grinding equipment, that kind of extra stuff. Maybe you get a bottle of gas. I think it's more helpful to be in the range of $1,000 to $2,000 to get a metalworking system going. That's a lot of money, but the things you can build are great, and I think it's worth it. How limiting is only having 110 power? If you're not doing up to 1/4 inch thick steel, it's not that limiting. But if you want to be able to do thicker stuff, it is limiting. So just look up the specs of the welder to see if it's going to prevent you from doing what you want to do. Which material would you start on for training purpose? For welding, I would start on anything around 1/8 of an inch thick mild steel. Just buy tons of that, flat bar, angle bar, cut it into sections, run beads on it. 1/8 inch is a nice thickness. You're not going to be like burning through that crazy easily. And I make a lot of things out of 1/8 inch. Between 1/8 inch and 1/4 is where I normally stick for steel stuff. So number one tip from getting started from absolute zero. I think this video is kind of my answer to that question. Is it as fun and badass as it looks? Yes, I love it. It is so much fun laying beads. I find it quite enjoyable. Yes, it is fun. Top 5 starter beginner power tools. Just bought a 20-volt drill impact set now. I went to build my garage, build out more. It's tough because it really depends on what your project is and the use case. One of the things that I'm really glad I invested in early was a deep cut bandsaw, the handheld kind for cutting metal, and then getting a Swag off-road table. It's a company that makes like a table that converts a porta bandsaw into a vertical bandsaw. And that investment alone was a lot of money. I can't remember, but it's been so worth it. That thing cuts metal like butter. works very, very well. I use it all the time. It's nice, small, and portable. You can't argue with having grinders. They're really, really helpful for metal prep. Getting a mask that you like is very helpful. I wish I had gotten some sort of belt sander earlier. You don't need a fancy metalworking one to get started. I just have a Ryobi one from Home Depot. That was $100 with just like 80 grit sandpaper. That's very helpful when you're making small brackets and stuff for quickly prepping those edges or rounding those edges. Would you recommend learning from YouTube, a friend, a workshop, your videos? Learn from YouTube. That's what I did. I paid attention very closely to watching other people weld if I had a chance to, but oftentimes there's just so much to learn. So that back and forth process of why is my weld behaving funny, watching a tutorial that shows one of those really nice shots where you can see the puddle, and then going, oh, that's more how that should look, and then coming back and doing it. So it also helps develop your ear with MIG welding. There's a specific sound of like a sizzling bacon sound if the weld is going well that you're looking for. And once you start to get a sense for what that sounds like when you're watching videos, it gets you familiar with that sound. So I highly recommend learning from YouTube. It's very effective. Where do you typically get your flat stock and angle tube from? Is that a local vendor? Yes, a lot of towns have metal supply stores. Some of them are more geared towards large quantities where you're having to buy 20-foot lengths. Other shops, like a fabrication shop, depending on the size of the shop, will sell you material, and they might even be willing to do cut sections to order as you just show up, and you don't need to phone ahead of time. Just call them and go, hey, do you mind if I come in and do a small order? And some shops will let you browse the racks of material. And for me, that is very helpful for understanding what do I need to build this, because I'm not as familiar with the material types. So do not go to Home Depot and buy metal from their rack. It is insanely expensive. It would be cool to hear your backstory of how you became passionate about it. I've kind of woven that into this video. And then also I made a video about how to learn how to get into welding in a week. That one I also included my backstory. But I mean, since I was a kid, I've been trying to make things and I've been trying to drill holes and bolt things together. And that is quite limiting. When I was getting into filmmaking, I was trying to make sliders and stuff. That was a big catalyst for some of the metalworking I was doing then. And yes, bolting stuff together is nice, but even then I didn't really know what materials were available for me to work with. So I was combining stuff in crazy concoctions, and I didn't really know how to drill holes in metal. It was a bit of a disaster, if I'm being honest with you, but I've liked building things for a long time. And metal is a great addition to that skill set. And the more practice you put in, the easier it gets. And I'm very thankful to have pressed into it in these past couple of years. It's a very useful skill. I recommend it. What would be a cool first project to start metalworking journey? Building a welding table. So go get some tubing, get a big sheet of thicker, like 1/4-inch material to make the tabletop out of. And that's a pretty forgiving project. I like bumper builds from Weld Together kits because the material is so thick. It's very forgiving. You're going to want a little bit more experience if you're going to be winching from that bumper, because you really want those welds to be strong enough to winch from the bumper. But Weld Together kits are often a great place because sometimes the hardest part is actually the cutting, the designing, and the fabricating. So yeah, that's some ideas. This is Killer Levi. Details on the door struts would be great. Also, what kind of hinges? For hinges, I used a housing and sleeve assembly that was actually made for rear swing away bumpers. Like, it's a Weld Together kit, and they had all the pieces. I bought one of those for a bumper I was going to build for the van, but I'm now building the rear bumper out of aluminum, so it was kind of useless. And I was just sitting around and I was thinking, oh, I could probably use 2 of those for the hinges here. Struts from McMaster Car, using their sizing guide and weight application. The struts are actually oversized. So one came with enough push force for the whole door. So I had to release gas to do this door, that kind of thing. That's the info. Becky and Chris is talking about, I'm pretty sure this is Becky leaving the comment about the detail shots to help understand exactly what's going on. And Becky and Chris do renovation videos as well and build projects. And it's always a struggle as a creator making a build project video, because you're not sure if it's worth making it like more tutorial teaching-esque or more just showing the story. And sometimes you're learning it as you're going, so doing the tutorial actually isn't worthwhile. So that's why I'm making a video like this, where I can try share some of the stuff that I have learned, but I'm not trying to overstep where my knowledge is. But Becky and Chris have great renovation videos. Highly recommend checking them out. Paint the rooftop of the container white, reduces the heat. Wear sunglasses when painting the top, it stops the glare. Yes, I'm going to paint the roof white.
it's got rust up there. It's got some stuff going on. So it's going to be a little bit before I can, like, it's not just easy enough to go up there and quickly paint it, but I will paint it white. Legend. When that strut bent, you were under the door. I was like, this is where I watched my friend Levi lose his arm. Glad you have your arms. Yes, I realized that in the video clips that I have of that moment, I didn't really show what was going on. The full pulley system was still holding the full weight of the door as I was installing it. And what I was doing was down at the brake releasing rope, so that way more weight was on the door and the strut to see how it would handle it. And then the strut wasn't going down over itself because of the reason that I explained in the video. It had too much pressure in it and it wasn't installed perfectly square to each other. And so I actually started pulling down on the door, and that's what gave the extra weight to really bend it over. And I didn't realize that it was bending from the angle that I was standing until it was too late. So that was a mistake on my part, but you can see that I'm like pulling down on the door, and that's what helped bent it. So when I'm over hanging out at the door after it's bent, the whole weight of the door is still being held with my pulley system, but I know that spooked a few people out. Please tell me you overbuilt and have redundancy built into it. That door is heavy and leveraged a lot. Yes, I did intentionally overbuild the brackets, so much so that when I was welding on the bracket, I was adding too much heat enough to bend it. I was overbuilding it, and that caused issues to the strut mounting because I was trying to overbuild it. So I do assure you, there was thought put into the way that this was put together, and I'm not intentionally creating a death trap. And there was other comments like, please think of safety as well. Yes, of course. I would not be sitting here underneath the door if I did not heavily consider the safety. I did build this in a way that I'm confident in, and it's okay if you're not. If you see things that I missed, I'm open to it, but I did build this overbuilt on the joints, I promise, even though I did make mistakes as I was making it. But if you're not convinced, that's okay. And if you have insights, that's okay. It's just part of making stuff. This is such a cool project. Do you ever have other makers as clients doing documentaries of their projects? Yeah, usually 1 or 2 a year. So I've made docu-series for several different clients. I don't always share that on the channel. I get that you wanted to make this yourself and it's super cool, but could you have accomplished this by cutting out a hole and use an off-the-shelf garage door system? Is that possible? Yes, it is possible to get an opening in a container with an off-the-shelf system. There's like self-contained rolling doors that are out of aluminum with a track system. Those are still wildly expensive, like a lot of money, and they don't accomplish the goal that I had of a covered shade area. So that's why I went the full custom route, and that ended up saving me money from an off-the-shelf solution. When you buy containers, you can get models that have bifold swing open doors. Those typically exist on 40-foot containers. You can get custom work done to containers before you buy them. But again, I bought mine the absolute cheapest that I could find because I was trying to save money, and it's already paid for itself when it was operating as a storage unit for ourselves instead of using a self-serve store. So I was strategic with the cheapest one that I could possibly buy, and we're still ahead if I had bought a container that had any kind of opening on it. And yeah, so yes and no and yes. Were you always into DIY projects like this? I'm curious how you got started. Professional construction / welding experience, YouTube reading, self-taught. You seem to have a natural into work. Okay. I don't think that what I'm doing is often that professional, if I'm being honest. And so how did I guess I'll try to answer this as quickly as possible. I feel like I could talk about building stuff for hours, so I got to be careful here. I've always liked the way that things are built. That's just something that interests me. So when I see a structure or something that has a cool operation to it, I'm curious about what about its design makes it do that. So no, I don't have any formal anything. Some of the people that I enjoy following are so wildly talented that that it's like it just puts into perspective the little amount that I know. But I highly recommend watching other building YouTube channels. I'll link some down below. Just seeing the way that people go about assembling a task to accomplish a job just gets your ideas flowing. Like seeing the different parts they use, the T-handle latches, the barrel pins, the way that they cut that material, seeing the tool that they used for that one job. All of those things help get my brain flowing. And then I kind of add that to my catalog of what I might want to use in the future for my budget. Designing and building things, it often, the good thing is that it often follows common sense. So when you assemble something and it's not behaving properly, there's often a way that you could have assembled it better to have it behave better. So when you've built a quantity of things, you start to realize, oh, building it in this way is not very great. Or sometimes you'll get halfway into a project and realize the way that I thought was a shortcut to building this better is actually a downside. And there's a reason why everyone else builds it this way. Certain principles like adding triangular gussets as supports, the principle of how much strength that adds to the joint is really, really cool. So getting familiar with some of those things really helps the assembly. I just ask a lot of questions. That's kind of the root of it. When I see people building things, I love going up and asking them questions. This has turned into an absolute monster of a video. I hope the questions were somewhat helpful for wherever you're at. Clearly, if you are noticing ways that I'm using wrong words or you're thinking of a better way to do it, you already know too much for a video like this. So don't worry. I'm not making this for you. I'm making it for other people like myself that are just trying to get started. So if you're the kind of person that wants to build more things out of metal, I highly recommend it. And make sure that you send me your projects that you're working on because it's so cool. I'm endlessly grateful for the other creators that kind of pushed me over the edge. Dave from SV Seeker was one of those people that really made me feel like, yeah, I can do this. I should get into it. Jimmy Diresta, he's another guy who I followed lots of his build projects, and just his approach and his style made me feel like I can do this. So I'm trying to pass some of that forward onto you, my audience, and just strongly recommend that it's so much fun to get into. And that's going to be it for this video. Make sure that you subscribe. Why would you still be watching if you aren't subscribed? Follow the playlist for my different build projects down below, the van build stuff, the container build series. And that's going to be it for this one. Remember, life's better when you make stuff. Oh, you can also grab this shirt. You can get this shirt. I probably should have said that earlier. It's on my website. Peace.